Hello, students, and welcome to Political Science 1513, American Federal Government. I am your instructor, Connor Alford, and this week we are going to discuss campaign finance as well as campaign finance law for our country. Towards that end, we have 6 major learning objectives, which I would like for you to focus on as you begin taking your notes. The first learning objective asks for you to summarize and explain the key developments and current realities of campaign finance law for our country. And I've added an asterisk at the end of this learning objective because there are 4 major developments that we're going to focus on for the purposes of our exams and quizzes in this class. We've got the FECA, or Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974. We've got its corresponding Supreme Court case, Buckley versus Vallejo. And then we've got the BCRA, which is also called the McCain-Feingold Act after its sponsors, or quite simply, BICRA. And just like the FECA, BICRA is going to have a corresponding Supreme Court case in which it is considered by the United States Supreme Court, and that case is probably familiar to you, Citizens United. So there are 4 major developments to focus on, 2 legislative, 2 judicial. The 2 legislative developments are the FECA and BICRA. The 2 judicial developments are going to be Buckley versus Vallejo and Citizens United. The second learning objective asks for you to discuss the various ways in which money can be spent or raised to help influence the outcome of an election. And to satisfy this learning objective, you're going to need to be able to understand and distinguish between certain key concepts. In particular, you will need to know the difference between hard money and soft money, independent expenditures and simple or direct campaign expenditures, PACs and super PACs, hard money and soft money. The third learning objective asks for you to detail what the court actually ruled in Citizens United. And the reason that I've added some asterisks to this learning objective is that there are a lot of common misconceptions about the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United that I want to clear up. So to fully satisfy this learning objective and do well on exams, you're going to need to be able to tell me not only what the court did rule in Citizens United, but what it did not rule, contrary to popular misconception. The fourth learning objective asks for you to articulate the main arguments both for and against Citizens United and the current system of campaign finance law that it created. The fifth learning objective is to describe the current levels, trends, and realities of campaign spending in the United States of America. And then finally, our sixth learning objective asks for you, the student, to identify the biggest classes of political spender in the United States and to describe how their money impacts elections. And we're going to go ahead and begin with that first learning objective. We're going to start at the very beginning. That means that we're going back to the year 1972 when we get the first major federal attempt to influence the overall amount of spending in politics for our country. So in other words, the FECA is important, first and foremost, because this is the first major attempt to control the influence of money in politics at the federal level. Prior to 1972, some states had similar policies that they had implemented, but this was the first time that the federal government was stepping in order to try and control or curb the influence of spending in politics. And the FECA is going to do a number of very important things. So the first thing that I want you to understand about the FECA and its impact is that it creates certain limits on campaign spending by candidates and their campaign organization. So a spending limit, you should understand, is a cap on the total amount of money that a candidate and or his or her campaign can spend out of their own coffers. So this would be like, for example, telling a billionaire like Bloomberg or maybe somebody like Donald Trump that they're not allowed to spend all of their own money in an attempt to buy their way into office. Instead, there's going to be a cap on the total amount of spending so that people who don't have as much money do still have some shot of actually winning. The second thing that the FECA is going to do after its passage in 1972 is create certain limits on fundraising. But I want you to understand that a limit on fundraising is not the same thing as a limit on spending. A limit on spending tells you how much of the money you already have or that you have raised you are allowed to use for the purpose of influencing the outcome of a particular election. A fundraising limit is different. Where a spending limit tells you how much you can spend, a fundraising limit tells you how you can raise that money. In particular, the fundraising limits of the FECA are going to create rules about how much the campaigns in our country are allowed to accept from a single donor. And generally speaking, the rule is that you cannot accept more than $2,600 from one individual. Now, you don't need to memorize that particular number, but what you do need to understand is that, again, this was an attempt to limit the corrupting influence of money in politics. There was concern that if an individual billionaire or a very wealthy corporation, union, bank, or some interest group wanted to, they could give a political candidate a massive sum of money in exchange for certain political promises. And if that's what's actually happening in our country, it's a problem, because it means that these candidates are essentially selling the laws of our country to the highest bidder, and they become more responsive to the wants, needs, and interests of wealthy donors than to the general public. At least that's the argument. Now, again, I don't know if that's actually happening, but there was a lot of concern about it at this time in our nation's history. So the FECA created limits telling campaigns you're not allowed to accept more than a certain amount of money from a single donor in an attempt to prevent corruption in the electoral process. But it's important to understand that just creating limits on spending and fundraising isn't actually going to be effective unless you have access to information on the spending and fundraising habits of the campaigns. You can't punish somebody for breaking a spending limit, for example, unless you know how much they've spent. So the FECA's third major contribution to our discussion is that it creates a series of reporting requirements, which require various campaigns to report any money they spend trying to influence the outcome of an election and any money they accept in the form of political contributions. Of course, it's also important to understand that the FECA was, at least initially, altogether ineffective. Why was it so ineffective? Well, it created reporting requirements, and it created limits on both spending and fundraising, but it had no enforcement mechanism. So, not 3 years later, in 1974, we're going to get an amendment to the FECA. And the amended version of the FECA is important because it creates the FEC. The FEC is the Federal Election Commission. And what I want you to know about the Federal Election Commission is that it remains to this very day the primary government agency responsible for monitoring campaign finances and enforcing campaign finance rules in our country. So all of this comes from the FECA, but the FECA still has certain problems. And the first problem that it's going to have to deal with is that it's applying these rules to both individuals and associations of individuals. When I say an individual, I'm talking about a private citizen or maybe even a married couple. But when I say an association of individuals, I'm talking about a large group of people working as a collective. And there are many different types of association. For example, we've got corporations, which are an economic association of individuals. But we also have unions, another form of economic association, and we have interest groups, and we have churches, and we have clubs, and we have groups of people in various other sizes, shapes, and forms. And it's really very difficult to address this. Now, some of this is simplified, because it is worth noting that there have been rules on the books for quite some time, which tell us that both both unions and corporations are prohibited from making direct financial contributions to political campaigns. And this is where we get into the next interesting aspect of the FECA. Not only does it apply its limits on spending and fundraising to both individuals and groups of individuals working as collectives, it's also going to apply these limits to the campaigns themselves and to independent spenders. What does that mean? What's the distinction here? Well, generally speaking, a campaign expenditure can be a direct or an independent expenditure. A direct or simple campaign expenditure is just any money that a candidate spends from his or her own bank account or the treasury of his or her actual campaign organization in order to try and win in an election. But in addition to direct spending by the candidates and their campaigns, we're also going to have to deal with independent expenditures. And an independent expenditure is money spent by a private party, a private group of individuals, or a private individual not associated or coordinating with the candidate's campaign. And this money is going to be spent by these third parties in order to influence the outcome of an election. So, for example, a campaign expenditure might involve Donald Trump using money that he raised for his 2016 campaign to produce a very large number of MAGA hats and distribute this campaign paraphernalia to voters in key states. It's money that Donald Trump himself or his campaign spends to win. But an independent expenditure would be a third party, an individual in the general public who has enough money to run an advertisement but doesn't personally know Donald Trump. If a private party decides that he or she or it, in the case of an association, wants to spend some of his, her, or its own money to help Donald Trump win, but has never spoken to Donald Trump, does not work with his or her campaign, and is not in any way coordinating with the Trump campaign, that's an independent expenditure. If you decided to spend some of your own personal funds to help a candidate win without directly talking to that candidate or simply sending them a check, that's probably an independent expenditure. And all of this is going to be important for a number of reasons. First, what we're going to find is that the FECA's application of limits on spending to individuals, and in particular to candidates themselves, is going to be challenged in the case of Buckley versus Vallejo. Now, I don't need you to memorize any dates or particulars, but what I do want you to understand about Buckley versus Vallejo is that it's going to overturn the FECA's limits on the amount of money that a candidate or campaign can spend from his or her own coffers. So the rule after Buckley versus Vallejo is that people like Bloomberg or Donald Trump are allowed to spend as much of their own money as they like trying to win an election. The limits on the amount of money they can accept from a single donor are left intact, however, because the Supreme Court tells us in Buckley versus Vallejo that it makes sense to try and limit the amount of money that a candidate can accept from a single donor in order to keep that donor from buying too much influence. In other words, the Supreme Court upholds the FECA's fundraising limits as a legitimate and effective mechanism for curbing corruption in politics. But it tells us that you cannot limit the amount of money that a candidate spends out of his or her own bank account. Why not? Well, they say, first off, that doesn't help with corruption. You cannot really expect that I am going to buy my own votes. I'm going to vote the way I'm going to vote, and the fact that I'm spending money to help myself get into the position to cast votes on legislation is not in and of itself corrupting in the same way that selling my votes to a third party might be. So there is no corruption incentive for limiting the amount of money that a candidate can spend from his or her own bank account. But more importantly, and this is a very, very significant part of Buckley versus Vallejo that needs to wind up in your notes. Buckley versus Vallejo tells us that spending for the purpose of winning an election is a form of protected speech. It constitutes a form of free speech protected by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So the notion that spending can be equated with speech and is therefore protected by the First Amendment begins not with Citizens United, as some people might have told you, but with the United States Supreme Court case of Buckley versus Vallejo all the way back in 1976. How do we justify this idea that spending is protected by the First Amendment's free speech clause? Well, the Supreme Court justifies this ruling with two distinct lines of argumentation that both lead to the same conclusion. First, they argue that spending constitutes a form of protected expression because it is necessary to access certain modes of speech. For example, if I wanted to run an advertisement providing information about my historical record as a contributor to my community while running for office, I'm going to have to pay for that advertising space. I'm not able to simply find a television station that's going to give up its airtime for free. So to access that entire mode of televised communication, I'm going to need money. And if you limit the amount of money I'm allowed to spend, then you are limiting my ability to communicate with the public. You are limiting my political expression or my capacity to share information with voters. And the courts tell us that's not okay under the First Amendment. You cannot limit or control the types of speech that people engage in for political purposes. The second line of argumentation, however, and this is important, is that spending can be a form of speech in and of itself. Because the courts have told us through a series of rulings like Tinker versus Des Moines that the free speech of our Constitution is not limited to literal verbal communication. It encompasses a wide range of expressive conduct. So, for example, there's nothing in the Constitution which says anything about making a post on Facebook. And yet the courts have generally told us that your Facebook posts are a protected form of political speech. How do we explain this? Well, because what they're going to tell us in their rulings is that when the Constitution says that our freedom of speech shouldn't be taken away, it's trying to protect our ability to express political views or share political information about government, our leaders, and candidates running for office. And that doesn't matter if we're literally verbally articulating this or if we're expressing ourselves by making a post on Facebook or wearing an anti-war armband or putting a bumper sticker on our car. Political expression is protected as First Amendment free speech, according to the Supreme Court. And what we're going to find in Buckley versus Vallejo is the court tells us that when you spend your own money trying to win in office, that's sending a message. That can sometimes be a way to express or share information. And a recent example of where this might hold true comes from the 2016 presidential election. Because during that election, it's very well known that Donald Trump spent a large sum of his own money trying to get into office. And he did this very thoughtfully. It wasn't simply about winning, it was about sending a message. Donald Trump wanted everybody to know that he was spending his own money instead of relying entirely on big donors, because he felt that a number of our political leaders had been corrupted by special interest groups that had a lot of money. And by spending his own money instead of relying on the contributions of these traditional interest groups, Donald Trump was sending a message that he was not going to be a part of that swamp, as he called it. By spending his own money instead of relying on contributions from third parties, Donald Trump was critiquing our current leadership. He was calling them corrupt. He was creating a contrast, saying, look, they're selling their votes to third-party donors so that they can win elections. But I don't have to do that because I have my own money. So I'm not going to be corrupted. I'm not going to be bought. And you can tell that because, again, I care enough about this to put my money where my mouth is. So the very act of spending money became a way that Donald Trump could send a message to the public. And Buckley versus Vallejo says that that's protected. So we get Buckley versus Vallejo. And basically what I want you to understand is that after Buckley versus Vallejo, the fundraising limits of the FECA are still intact. And some of the spending limits are also still intact on independent expenditures. But the limits on the amount of money that a campaign can spend or that a candidate can spend from his or her own bank account, those are overturned by Buckley versus Vallejo. So now campaigns are allowed to spend as much money as they want. They just have to raise that money from a larger number of donors. You still have that limit on the amount you can accept from a single contributor, but if you have enough contributors, you can raise essentially infinite money after Buckley versus Vallejo. Of course, even then, those existing limits on independent expenditures aren't all that effective. And the reason that they're not very effective has to do with this distinction between what we call hard money and what we call soft money. And I'm going to give you a definition for each of these terms so that we can draw the distinction and explain how this distinction is exploited by campaign contributors to get around the FECA's limits on campaign expenditures. So hard money is money directly contributed to a campaign or independently spent for the explicit purpose of helping a candidate to win. So there are really two major types of hard money expenditure. You can first look at hard money, which is given directly to a candidate's campaign. If you write a check for $50 to Bernie Sanders or to Joe Biden or to Kamala Harris or to Donald Trump or to Mitt Romney or to Congressman Mullen or to Joseph Silk or whoever, if you send money directly to a campaign from your bank account, that counts as a form of hard money. Another form of hard money is when you go out and you spend your own money independently, not coordinating with a particular campaign, but in whatever advertisement you run with that money, you explicitly endorse a candidate. So if Donald Trump spent any of his own money to run an advertisement saying vote Trump, that's a form of hard money. That's a clear campaign expenditure. But at the same time, if you, acting on your own without ever having spoken to Donald Trump, spent your own money to run an advertisement that said vote Donald Trump explicitly, well then that is also a form of hard money expenditure. So hard money is any money contributed directly to a campaign or spent independently for the explicit purpose of supporting a particular candidate. Soft money is distinct. Soft money is money which is independently spent to influence the outcome of an election without explicitly endorsing a particular candidate. And there are really going to be two major types of soft money expenditure that we need to talk about and that you should understand. First, you have what is called issue advocacy. Issue advocacy is when you spend money promoting a particular position during an election cycle. So, for example, if you were Planned Parenthood and you wanted to help Donald Trump win in the election of 2008, you would run into this problem, where as a tax-funded corporation, you are prohibited from spending money to influence the outcome of an election. You cannot endorse candidates. But you might be able to get around that with soft money, because in 2008, the only pro-choice candidate running for president was Barack Obama. So if you wanted to support him, but you know you're not allowed to explicitly try to influence the outcome of an election, what you can do is run an advertisement in which you say, vote pro-choice. You promote laws that are permissive of abortion. And you can get away with this, knowing that it's going to help Barack Obama as the only pro-choice candidate in that particular race, but still having some plausible deniability. Because if you ran that ad during an election cycle, sure, it will probably help the pro-choice candidate, who is Barack Obama. But it's very difficult for me to prove that you ran that advertisement in order to help Barack Obama, and not simply because you feel really strongly about the issue of abortion, which, by the way, Planned Parenthood does. And by the way, Planned Parenthood did do this. But it's not really clear whether they did it because they wanted to help Barack Obama win the election or because they want laws that are permissive of abortion. What is clear is that you're allowed to spend money to make your opinions on issues like abortion known to the public, and this is true regardless of whether you are a tax-funded corporation or a private citizen. So soft money, again, can take the form of issue advocacy, where you promote a particular policy, preference, and that indirectly helps a candidate who shares that preference to win during an election cycle. But we also have what we call party building activities, and this is another form of soft money expenditure. When you spend money to strengthen a political party, this is a party building activity. And there are a couple of major forms of party building activity, the most obvious of which is going to be the voter registration drive. So if you're the ACLU, for example, you again cannot spend very much money trying to directly support a particular candidate. But if you want to help Democrats to win an election, you don't really have to spend all that money explicitly endorsing Democratic candidates. Instead, what you can do is you can make sure that unregistered voters who tend to identify with the Democrats get registered in time to make a difference. So find a place where you know a bunch of low turnout voters who preferentially look to the Democratic Party and get them registered. In 2016, the ACLU spent a whole bunch of time registering voters in northern Philadelphia. Why? Well, because that's a very urban, very African American, and fairly poor group of people. And they know that urban African Americans who are low on the income scale almost always vote Democrat if they vote at all. The ACLU did not spend a lot of time registering poor rural voters or people who live in trailer parks. Why? Because poor rural voters and people who live in trailer parks don't vote Democrat. They were strengthening the Democratic Party by running registration drives in particular places. But again, I cannot prove to anybody with any reasonable legal standard in a court of law that they ran those registration drives solely for the purpose of influencing the outcome of an election. Sure, they spent money to put those voter registration drives together, but maybe they just want to make sure everyone's turning out to vote. As long as they don't explicitly tell people once registered, hey, go vote for Hillary Clinton, or hey, go vote for Democratic candidate Joe Schmo, that's soft money. And what we're going to find is that soft money, in the form of issue advocacy or in the form of party building activities or in any other shape, is altogether unregulated even after the FECA. There are no limits on the amount of money that an individual can spend, that a corporation or a union or other association can spend sharing opinions on key issues or strengthening a particular political party, even though such expenditures can influence the outcome of an election. So what we're going to find is that after the FECA, wealthy individuals and associations of individuals are going to replace hard money contributions spent to explicitly endorse or directly contribute to a particular candidate with an equivalent amount of soft money expenditures in the form of issue advocacy or party building activities. And that's the reality that is going to prevail for about 30 or so years. And the first attempt to really address that comes in 2002. This is our third major development, and it's the BCRA, BICRA, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. Now, again, there's a lot that I can say about the BCRA, but I'm going to simplify it for the purpose of our lecture. The BCRA applies those limits on independent expenditures created by the FECA to soft money, so that now there are caps not only on the amount of money that an individual can contribute directly to a campaign or independently spend to explicitly endorse a candidate, but also to how much money they can spend sharing political opinions on issues like abortion or gun control or gay rights during an election cycle. There are limits now after BCRA on how much money you can spend registering voters during an election cycle. So this, again, is an attempt to rein in the use of soft money as a mechanism to circumvent limits on hard money. But it runs into an immediate constitutional challenge, because we're going to jump ahead to the year 2008. And in 2008, we have another highly contentious presidential election. But we're not looking at the general election. We're looking at the primary election on the Democrat side. Because in 2008, everybody assumed that the Democratic candidate was going to be Hillary Clinton. But out of the blue, this dark horse candidate, a dude by the name of Barack Obama, shows up and he challenges Hillary Clinton in a primary. Ultimately, we know that Barack Obama is going to beat Hillary Clinton in that primary election. He will become the Democratic candidate for the 2008 general election, and he will eventually win. He'll take his place in the White House. But at this time, that hasn't happened yet, and the race is really tight. It's very close between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, though, she's going to run into a problem, because there's this group called Citizens United, which is a 501c3 not-for-profit interest group. And they're going to spend some money to produce an independent film called Hillary the Movie. And Hillary the Movie is basically a documentary. Now, it never explicitly tells people to vote for Barack Obama, and it doesn't explicitly say vote against Hillary Clinton. But it does basically go through her very long political career, dig up a whole bunch of dirt, and paint a portrait of Hillary Clinton, which is very unflattering. And then the organization, Citizens United, is going to spend a bunch of money to air this documentary negatively reflecting upon Hillary Clinton to as many voters as they can. And again, what we're going to find is that at the end of the day, all they're really doing is providing information about our political leaders. So they argue, the way they see it, they're within their rights. The First Amendment protects our ability to share negative information about our leaders. But Hillary Clinton's campaign, they don't see things that way. The way Hillary Clinton sees it, this is a form of soft money. This is the group, Citizens United, violating the BCRA's application of spending limits on soft money to try and help Barack Obama defeat her. So she's going to go to the FEC, and the FEC is basically going to side with Hillary Clinton against Citizens United. The FEC censors their documentary. It tells them that they are not allowed to broadcast this documentary, that they are not allowed to showcase this documentary until after the election. Now, after the election, if they want to put it on air, that's fine. But until such time, they're being silenced. And they're not happy about it. So Citizens United retaliates by suing the FEC. Now, let me be clear. The FEC was right. What Citizens United did is undeniably against the BCRA. But Citizens United would counter-argue by saying, well, sure, we violated the BCRA's limits on the amount of money you can spend sharing information about political leaders during an election. But those limits are themselves a violation of the Constitution, and the Constitution takes precedent. In other words, in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, a 2010 Supreme Court case, Citizens United asks the United States Supreme Court to overturn the BCRA altogether, to overturn the BCRA's limits on soft money expenditures. And that's exactly what's going to happen. So now we're at our fourth and final major development in the history of campaign finance law for our country. And in this case, Citizens United, the Supreme Court is going to strike the portions of the BCRA which limit soft money expenditures for independent parties. So after Citizens United, you're allowed to spend as much money as you want in order to share information about political leaders or your opinions on elections or your opinions on key issues. There are still going to be limits on the amount of money you can spend explicitly endorsing candidates or that you can contribute directly to candidates. Those haven't gone away. But the BCRA's application of those limits to issue advocacy and other forms of soft expenditure are overturned by Citizens United, which basically means that after Citizens United, we're going to go back to where we were after Buckley versus Vallejo, but before the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. However, there are, again, a lot of misconceptions about what Citizens United did or how the court justified its decision. So first, let me be clear. This case was not explicitly about corporations. It was about associations of individuals. And one type of association of individual is the corporation. But there are many other types of associations or groups of individuals that are also going to benefit, including unions and banks and interest groups and so on and so forth. And it's also important to understand that contrary to what you might have heard, there is absolutely nothing in Citizens United or any other Supreme Court ruling that ever says that corporations are persons. Nothing in U.S. law says that corporations are persons or that they have the same constitutional rights and protections as persons. So make sure you've written that down in your notes. Citizens United does not say that corporations are persons. Neither does any Supreme Court case or law in the history of our country. Finally, Citizens United does not say that spending is speech. Remember, that precedent was set by Buckley versus Vallejo. Now, Citizens United does not challenge that precedent. So it is consistent with the conclusion that spending is speech. But remember, the Supreme Court made that statement all the way back in 1976, way before the 2010 decision of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. So let's take a moment and let's look at the reasoning in this case. Let's look at how the court was able to justify its decision that the application of the FECA's limits on spending to soft money by the BCRA was unconstitutional. And the first, most important argument that the court is going to present in this case is that the First Amendment is there to protect not only speakers, but speech itself. So, what the court tells us in Citizens United, drawing upon a prior case called the First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, is that, quite simply, the force and function of the First Amendment is to protect the free flow of ideas in our society so that the people have access to information which is not controlled by the government. And they tell us, I quote, that Supreme Court precedent makes it clear. Okay, here's where the quote begins. Political speech does not lose its First Amendment protection simply because its source is a corporation. In Bellotti, the court has rejected the argument that political speech of a corporation or other association should be treated differently under the First Amendment simply because such associations are not natural persons. Okay, so again, they are recognizing that they are not natural persons. They are not saying that they are persons, but they're saying that the identity of a speaker is not relevant. What's relevant is that the First Amendment protects free speech, period. Regardless of who is engaging in a form of expressive conduct, regardless of who is communicating or sharing information with the public, the government does not get to control that correspondence. The court goes on to tell us that if the First Amendment has any meaning, if the First Amendment has any force, it is quite simply this, that the government cannot jail or punish citizens or associations of citizens simply for engaging in political speech. So again, the first major argument that the court presents in defense of its conclusion that it is unconstitutional for Congress to prohibit people from spending unlimited amounts of money sharing their opinions on political issues or sharing information on political leaders is that speech is in and of itself protected, independent of the identity of its speaker. The next major argument that they're going to articulate does, however, correspond to the freedom of speech, but is not limited to corporations. The court does tell us, relying on a number of other decisions, that the freedom of speech does not have to be exercised in isolation. While it is true that my First Amendment right protects my ability to say I support candidate X, the court tells us that it also protects our ability to come together as a collective and say we support candidate X. So what this means then is that the freedom of speech, the freedom to communicate political information, is a freedom held both by individuals and associations of individuals. And again, remember what I've already told you. A corporation, like a union, is just a form of economic association. It's a group of individuals operating as a collective to achieve some central goal. And so that's going to be protected on a second degree, for a second reason, according to a second line of argumentation articulated by the court. Of course, the court also has a tertiary argument, a third argument. Well, they tell us that, look, at the end of the day, when you're running campaign advertisements or releasing documentaries that talk about our political leaders, you're just providing information to the public. Now, it might be that your information is bad or it's unbiased, that it's biased. It's not entirely balanced. Fine, okay, but the government is not, according to the court, our proper arbiter of truth. The government doesn't get to serve as an epistemic regulator like the medieval church. It doesn't have the authority to tell the public what information is good or bad, or try to control the amount of influence that different interests are able to exert through their speech. At the end of the day, it's up to us, the people, not our government, to decide whether or not a particular communicator is credible. So if you want to take the word of an oil corporation that global warming is not man-made, fine. That's your prerogative. The court doesn't necessarily agree with you, but you get to decide whether or not a speaker is credible, not government, according to the court in this case. Finally, the court basically tells us that there's no real evidence that these expenditures do have a corrupting influence. Now, again, if you're contributing them directly to candidates, that's a different story, because then you can quite literally buy votes. But there's no real evidence that an independent expenditure spent by a private party without any form of correspondence or association with the candidate they're trying to support or who is benefiting from their communication forms a quid pro quo. There's no evidence of bribery or corruption here because, again, there's no direct communication. The candidate didn't know that you were going to go out and run that ad, so how can they have made a bargain with you wherein they agree to give you a policy in exchange for it? Well, they can't. So what we're going to find then is that these are the main arguments, and yet we're not done because there is one more argument. The court points out that the most common type of corporation that will spend money providing information during an election is the media. Because in our country, we don't have government-controlled press. The press is controlled by private corporations. We've got news organizations that incorporate for tax purposes, and these are going to own basically all of the media outlets with which we are familiar. Fox News, CNN, CBS, MSNBC, Huffington Post, New York Times, all of these are private corporations. So if we start to say that the government has the authority to limit the amount of resources that corporations spend in order to share information during an election cycle, that would necessarily mean that the government is able to tell CNN that it's not allowed to run a story critical of leaders during a critical election. And that's quite clearly, as the court tells us, incompatible and inconsistent with the central function, purpose, and court understanding of the First Amendment. So those are the big arguments for Citizens United, and those are the justifications that the court articulates to justify its decision. So where does that leave us? Where are we in the post-Citizens United world? Well, what we're going to discover is that certain portions of the FECA are still in effect. Hard money is still limited for both individuals and associations of individuals. Corporations and unions are still prohibited from making any direct or hard money expenditure in support of a candidate. And what we're also going to find is that those reporting and disclosure requirements, they're all still active. The FEC, the Federal Election Commission, created by that 1976 amendment to the FECA, well, it's still kicking. It's still there. It's still doing its thing. But what we are going to discover is that candidates and their campaigns are allowed to spend any amount of money that they want in order to try and win because of Buckley versus Vallejo. Although, do keep in mind that when they're raising that money, those fundraising limits are still in place. So they would not be able to simply accept a massive donation from one person and then go out and spend it, or a massive donation from a single association and then use that to buy an election. But if they can raise $10 million by getting 1 million people to give them $10 each, well, they can spend that. If they can get 2 million people to give them $10 each, well, then they can spend 20 million. There's no limits on how much they can spend, but those limits on how they raise that money are still in effect. And then finally, after Citizens United, we're going to see the emergence of what we call a super PAC. And to understand what a super PAC is, we also need to talk about a concept called the PAC or PAC. And PAC really quite simply is Political Action Committee. A political action committee, to break the acronym out, is essentially a way of pooling funds. More specifically, a PAC is a committee set up by an association or an individual to pool resources, which can then be used as hard money expenditures in order to affect the outcome of an election. So basically, this would be like if the corporation British Petroleum wanted to give money to a candidate, but discovered that, again, we have laws which prohibit corporations from making direct contributions. So the corporation cannot spend directly from its treasury in order to help a candidate, but it can establish a PAC, a separate committee with its own bank account, and then it can go to each of its investors or its board members, and it can say, hey, let's each give a certain amount of money to this PAC, and then the PAC will funnel that money to our favorite candidate. That's okay. That's allowed even before Citizens United. After Buckley versus Vallejo, PACs became quite common. But what we're going to discover is that because they spend hard money, and because limitations on hard money apply under the FECA to both individuals and associations of individuals, such as the PAC, there are a great number of stringent rules and regulations limiting the amount of money that a PAC can spend, how, when, and where. So PACs are heavily regulated, and they spend hard money to directly support candidates. But after Citizens United, we're going to get a separate kind of PAC, which is the Independent Expenditure Only PAC. And Independent Expenditure Only PACs are commonly called super PACs based on a nickname applied to them by the media. So what is a super PAC, and how is it different from a regular PAC? Well, it's been exposed to uranium and developed superpowers. Nah, I'm just kidding. Look, a super PAC is an independent expenditure only PAC, meaning that it is a political action committee that can accept unlimited amounts of donations from an unlimited number of contributors, but it's only allowed to spend that money independently on soft advocacy. So it can run an endless number of ads which promote a particular issue position. But it is not allowed under any circumstances to ever directly contribute to a candidate's campaign treasury, or explicitly endorse a candidate, or communicate or coordinate in any way, shape, or form with that candidate and his or her campaign. So it is essentially allowed to raise and spend unlimited amounts of money, but only on soft money expenditures like party building activities that are registering voters, or issue advocacy that presents arguments in defense of certain policy options. Now, we do suspect that such expenditures can affect the outcome of an election, but again, it's very, very difficult to prove, and it's very, very difficult to prove that the expenditures used to advocate for particular issue positions are being spent intentionally to influence the outcome of an election. It could very well be that the people who put together these PACs just really, really feel strongly about those issues. I don't know. And so again, that's essentially unregulated. And a lot of people are very concerned about this system. So I've given you the arguments articulated by the court itself in defense of the Citizens United ruling and the system of campaign finance that it created in our country, that we still live under to this day with some slight modifications. However, it's also important to understand why some people are concerned about this. And the most significant argument articulated by opponents of Citizens United is that it gives wealthy interests an undue influence. It allows them to have more speech than everybody else. What they tell us is that in Citizens United, the court should have overturned Buckley versus Vallejo, that we cannot allow the notion that spending is a form of speech to exist in our country. Because if spending is speech, you cannot have equal speech, in that some people have more money to spend than others. I can't afford to drop $1 million supporting my favorite candidate or my favorite issue position, whereas a billionaire like Bloomberg or Donald Trump might be able to do so. And so basically what they're arguing is, look, if we allow individuals and associations of individuals, especially corporations, which opponents of Citizens United tend to dislike, to spend unlimited amounts of money, we give them unlimited influence during election cycles, and that in turn might be very corrupting. That might cause political leaders to again become more responsive to those who can spend a whole bunch of money on issue advocacy or party building activities than their own voters. Now, we don't know if that's true, but it very well could be. It sounds plausible. It's hard to measure that one way or the other, but it's a possibility. And the mere concern is, for many people, sufficient to say, Citizens United got it wrong. Now, I'm not going to tell you where to stand or how to fall on this issue, but I do want you to understand that many people oppose Citizens United because they feel that it creates corruption, A, and B, it gives wealthy interests undue influence over the democratic process. We're almost done now, but I do want to briefly hit upon those last couple learning objectives. So let's look at current trends in campaign finance and spending for our country. I've got some numbers for the 2018 election cycle that was the last full election as of the recording of this video. And what we're going to find is that the amount of money spent during this period was astronomical. I won't read the numbers off of the slide to you because the details here aren't all that relevant, and I assume that you can read them yourself. You're familiar with Arabic numerals. But they're very large numbers, and that was for a midterm election. If you compare this to a presidential election, the number goes up. So in 2016, for example, across the campaign of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, we had about $6.5 billion spent. And that's a lot of money. That money could be used by Oklahoma to cover all of its education expenditures, all of its expenditures on Veterans Affairs, health initiatives, and the military. All of that could be covered with money left over if the money spent by presidential candidates and their campaigns to win had instead been funneled towards our state. So the bottom line then is that we spend a lot of money. One thing I want you to know is that campaigns are getting more and more expensive. And I want you to know that in the United States, our campaigns have always been more expensive and have always lasted longer than campaigns in other countries. But the extent to which we can say that this is a problem is very, very difficult to gauge. Because while you might look at these numbers and say, wow, that's a lot of money, it's also important to put things in perspective. It's a lot of money compared to what, for example, is a very important question to ask yourself. Because the same year that we spent $6.5 billion on presidential races, we spent $7.5 billion on potato chips around our country. And we can probably say that, hey, look, the campaign deciding who will be the leader of the free world is a little bit more important than junk food. And yet we spent a lot more money on junk food than we did on deciding who would be our president. So I don't know. Maybe this number's out of control. Maybe it's not. But it's also important to understand that we don't really know whether or not the money has an effect. And to explain that, let's take a look at how the money is being spent. So first, I want to be clear. There are no universal rules about how a campaign spends its money. Different campaigns at different levels in different areas with their own sets of strategic considerations are going to spend their money differently. But generally speaking, what we're going to find is that the single largest expenditure for any political campaign goes to running television advertisements. This is definitely true for presidential elections, but also for congressional elections and even for a lot of state offices. There is, however, one major exception to this, and that, of course, is Donald Trump. Because as some of you might know, Donald Trump in 2016 didn't spend a dime. He didn't spend a penny on running television advertisements. That's an exception, and it's basically the only exception that I'm able to identify at this time. By and large, campaigns spend a lot of money on television advertisements, and then they're going to spend a bunch of money on campaign literature and the proliferation of those pamphlets, essentially. They're going to run some radio ads, they're going to have some newspaper ads, and then they're going to spend a bunch of money on voter registration and get out the vote drives, where they send people door knocking and trying to get everyone to turn out. Here's the interesting thing. Of all of these items, that 1% is the only thing that empirical literature has proven to work. So studies consistently find that get out the vote drives, that voter registration drives, that door knocking, face-to-face, the ground game, that can really make a difference in a tight election. Now, if it's not a tight election, it's not a big enough difference to alter the outcome. But if it's really, really close, a superior ground game can help to explain why one candidate was able to eke out a victory come election day. When we're looking at television advertisements and campaign literature, when we're looking at radio ads, however, the empirical literature is mixed at best. And if we're honest, most of the literature seems to suggest that running television advertisements doesn't work. Nobody is convinced to vote for or against you because of a television advertisement. And some forms of advertisement have actually been shown by a number of studies to be counterproductive. So, for example, one thing that a lot of campaigns have done until recently is run automated calls, trying to remind people to vote or provide people with information which either reflects positively upon the candidate or negatively upon that candidate's opponent. But people really, really hate getting automated calls. And so, as it turns out, you start sending automated calls to people, that inspires them to vote against you. So again, what we're going to find is that most of what this money is being spent on is essentially profligate. It's not necessarily effective. Now, again, we haven't proven this one way or the other. There's still some debate. But the academic literature, at least, tells us that television advertisements aren't effective. Campaign literature probably isn't effective. Face-to-face interactions, those work, but campaigns aren't spending a lot of money on that. So, at the end of the day, we don't really know what effect money has on electoral outcomes. We do know that the candidate who spends the most usually wins. But we also happen to realize that that's because the people who usually win are the incumbents, the people who are currently in power, and incumbents tend to have more money to spend. We also know that people are more likely to give money to a candidate who they know is going to win even before election day. And so it might be a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, we don't know if they're getting more money because they're going to win or if they're winning because they get more money. Very hard to figure that out. Most likely, however, we suspect, in academia at least, that they're getting more money because they're going to win. And they're going to win because they're already in office and there's an incumbent advantage of 98%. So, once we've established that we have no idea how this money is affecting things, whether it's corrupting or whether it's even making a difference in the election, it's worthwhile to spend a couple of minutes looking at who gives the money. And there is a perception in the public that, at least in Citizens United, the groups that give the most money are corporations, but that's not actually true. Most campaign contributions and expenditures are still ultimately coming from individuals. Now, some individuals are giving substantially more than others, but again, if you look at the big donations to the small donations, it turns out that a very large number of small donations outweighs a relatively small number of large donations. So, small donations from private citizens still make up a bigger portion of campaign finance than large donations from corporations, banks, so on and so forth. And even if we limit our attention to associations, it's not actually the corporations that seem to be spending the most. It's going to be unions. Now, all of this is changing. The proportion of finances in campaigns coming from associations as opposed to individuals is changing very rapidly, and we are finding that a larger portion of contributions are coming from associations now than in the past. We are also going to find that corporations are slowly catching up with unions. It used to be that unions handily outspent corporations, and now there's a little bit more competition. But by and large, what we're going to find is that corporations tend not to spend a lot of money on electioneering or supporting candidates. They do spend a decent amount of money on lobbying people who are in government or on lobbying bureaucratic decision makers. But when it comes to trying to affect the outcomes of elections, by and large, when we're looking at associations, unions still have quite a lead on corporations, banks, and other types of organizations. There's also been a perception, among certain people at least, that Republicans consistently spend more than Democrats. And I think that this perception derives from the fact that people who tend to be higher on the socioeconomic ladder are more likely to identify as Republicans. But in reality, what we're going to find is that For quite some time now, Democrats have consistently outraised Republicans, and this was especially true in 2016. Now, if you want to look at the specific numbers, you're welcome to check opensecrets.org, which is a very reputable source that tracks campaign finances using government reports and so on and so forth. But what we're going to find is that by and large, individuals give more than groups. Unions give more than corporations, and Democrats give more than Republicans. Democrat campaigns tend to spend a substantially larger sum of money than Republicans, and a big part of that is that they're better at fundraising. They tend to raise more money than do Republicans, and a part of that has to do with where their support bases are located. What we're going to discover is that Democrats tend to be very strong in places like California and New York, and hey, it turns out that there are a lot of wealthy interests in places like California and New York. So, those are the current classes of contributor who spend in campaign elections. But at the end of the day, I do want you to remember, we're not even sure if this money is working. It's much more likely that the people who spend more are winning more because they're incumbents. They raise more money because they're recognized, and they're recognized because they're already in office, so they're already going to win. All right, that's the end of this lecture. Have a nice week, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.